Asking someone what they did for work could end a friendship. Victorian social rules extended far beyond table manners and tea service. Every aspect of public life was governed by unspoken codes that determined acceptable behavior. Modern people would break most of these rules within minutes of entering Victorian society. The restrictions covered topics you couldn't discuss, movements you couldn't make, and emotions you couldn't express. Before we start, subscribe to our channel to learn more about the Victorian times. Let's explore 20 shocking Victorian social rules you'd definitely violate. Never ask someone's occupation. Inquiring about someone's profession was considered deeply personal and intrusive. The question implied the person might work for living, suggesting lower social status. Upper-class Victorians didn't work in the modern sense. They managed estates, sat in Parliament, or engaged in gentleman pursuits. Asking about occupation implied they might need employment, which was insulting. Questions asked of slight acquaintances had to concern general subjects only. Victorian etiquette manuals specifically stated that topics like family or profession could only be discussed if the person introduced those subjects first. Bringing them up yourself showed poor breeding and nosiness. The rule created awkward social situations. Meeting someone new meant discussing weather, shared acquaintances, and current events, while carefully avoiding any question about how they spent their days or supported themselves. Never talk about money. Discussing finances, prices, or personal wealth violated fundamental Victorian etiquette. Money talk was considered vulgar regardless of context. You couldn't mention what things cost, how much you earned, or financial concerns of any kind. The topic was forbidden in polite conversation. Only the working classes discussed money openly, marking them as common. This created practical difficulties. How did you negotiate purchases or discuss household expenses without mentioning money? Victorians developed coded language and indirect references that allowed necessary financial discussions without direct money talk. The rule reinforced class distinctions. Wealthy people supposedly didn't concern themselves with prices. Discussing costs suggested you had to budget carefully, marking you as not truly wealthy. Never discuss illness. Talking about sickness, especially your own, was strictly forbidden. Health complaints suggested weakness and poor self-control. Victorian etiquette books from the 1880s specifically instructed people to avoid talking about ill health or afflictions of any kind. The advice appeared in multiple conduct manuals, including rules for gentlemen. Discussing illness tested the patience of listeners and marked you as self-absorbed. You couldn't mention a headache, describe symptoms, or explain an absence due to sickness. If someone asked about your health after an illness, you responded briefly and changed topics quickly. The rule extended to discussing others' illnesses. Calling cards could be left at households experiencing illness to express concern, but detailed health discussions violated proper conduct. Disease and suffering were private matters not suitable for social conversation. Women never eat on the street. Ladies couldn't consume food while walking in public. Eating on the street marked a woman as lower class and lacking refinement. A woman might enter a tea room or restaurant, but eating while standing or walking violated proper conduct. The rule applied to all food, not just meals, but any snacks or treats purchased from street vendors. Working-class women who needed to eat quickly during brief breaks from labor ate on streets. This practical necessity became a class marker. Refined women had time and places to sit and eat properly. The restriction reflected Victorian beliefs about feminine delicacy. Eating was somewhat undignified, requiring opening one's mouth, chewing, potentially making mess. Proper ladies minimized public eating and never combined it with movement. No public displays of affection. Physical contact between courting couples was forbidden in public spaces. Even married couples couldn't hold hands where others might see. A courting couple required constant chaperoning. They were never alone together. Physical contact was limited to specific formal gestures, a gentleman offering his arm to a lady, helping her into a carriage. Holding hands suggested intimacy inappropriate for public view. Kissing was absolutely scandalous. Any gesture beyond prescribed formal interactions violated proper conduct and damaged both parties' reputations. The rules were somewhat relaxed for married couples, but public affection remained improper. Marriage didn't grant license for public physical contact beyond walking arm in arm. Never step aside for lower class. Class hierarchy determined who yielded space on sidewalks and streets. Lower-class people stepped aside for upper-class people, never the reverse. A gentleman might step aside for a lady of his class or higher, but stepping aside for someone of lower rank confused social order and appeared foolish. This created practical street navigation governed by instant class assessment. Clothing, bearing, and context revealed social rank. People made split-second decisions about who yielded path. Misjudging someone's class and failing to yield when appropriate or yielding when inappropriate both carried social consequences. Proper Victorians became expert at reading class markers instantly. Never express strong opinions in mixed company. Contentious topics and passionate arguments violated conversation rules. The goal was pleasant exchange, not debate. Political discussions, religious arguments, and controversial topics were forbidden in mixed company. Victorian etiquette manuals stated that the drawing room was not a court of justice. Dinner parties were not debate halls. Any subject that stirred contention had to be avoided. Women especially were warned against expressing strong opinions or engaging in controversial conversation. Their role was to be agreeable and pleasant, not intellectually challenging. The prohibition against absorbing topics appeared in multiple etiquette guides. No subject of deep interest was permitted because it might lead to actual discussion. Polite conversation required staying superficial and avoiding anything that could spark genuine debate. If someone drops something, pretend not to notice. When someone dropped an item, you ignored it unless specifically asked to help. Noticing the error drew attention to someone's clumsiness. The rule reflected Victorian emphasis on maintaining dignity. Dropping something was embarrassing. Drawing attention by immediately helping compounded the embarrassment. You pretended not to notice, allowing the person to retrieve their item without audience. Only if they explicitly requested assistance or clearly struggled could you offer help. This created awkward moments where everyone watched someone fumble for a dropped item while maintaining elaborate pretense of not noticing. Never brag about achievements. Discussing personal accomplishments marked you as vulgar and self-important. Modesty was essential to good breeding. You couldn't mention awards, successes, or achievements even when directly relevant to conversation. Telling stories that showcased your cleverness or capabilities violated proper conduct. Parents discussing their children's accomplishments was specifically forbidden in etiquette manuals. Such talk tested listeners' patience and marked the parent as poorly bred. Achievements could be known through others mentioning them, but self-promotion in any form was absolutely unacceptable. Proper people appeared modest regardless of actual accomplishments. Never admit boredom. Expressing boredom was deeply insulting to hosts and companions. You maintained appearance of interest and engagement regardless of actual feelings. Etiquette books specifically instructed people not to appear listless or indifferent when others talked. Victorian conduct manuals advised making it a point to seem interested in conversation even when you weren't. Yawning, checking timepieces, or any gesture suggesting tedium violated conduct. You remained attentive and engaged through hours of potentially tedious social interaction. This created psychological strain. Maintaining appearance of interest through truly boring conversations required effort and self-discipline considered marks of proper breeding. Never acknowledge someone across the street. You couldn't greet acquaintances on the opposite side of the street unless properly introduced at that moment. Street acknowledgement required proximity. Shouting greetings across streets violated rules about public voice levels and appropriate distance for social interaction. If you saw someone you knew across the street, you either crossed to greet them properly or pretended not to notice. The rule reflected Victorian emphasis on controlled, formal interaction. Casual distance greetings suggested inappropriate familiarity and lack of proper ceremony. Meeting someone required specific protocols. Random acknowledgement across distances disrupted proper introduction and greeting procedures that governed all Victorian social contact. Never run in public. Running indicated distress or emergency. Proper people walked at measured pace regardless of circumstances. Running suggested you lacked time management skills and had to rush. It also implied lower class origins. Working people ran between jobs to maximize time. The only acceptable reason for running was genuine emergency requiring immediate action. Even then, a gentleman should maintain dignity while moving with purpose. The rule created practical problems when actually needing to hurry. Victorians developed fast walking techniques that allowed speed without the indignity of running. Never adjust clothing in public. Any clothing adjustment had to happen in private. Public adjustments of any garment piece violated proper conduct. You couldn't straighten a collar, adjust a sleeve, or fix any displaced clothing element where others might see. Such adjustments suggested either your clothing didn't fit properly or you couldn't dress yourself correctly. The rule extended to adjusting hats, gloves, or any accessory. Everything had to remain as initially arranged until you reached private space to make corrections. This must have created significant discomfort. Ill-fitting garments or displaced items had to be endured until appropriate private moment for adjustment. Never remove coat without apology. A gentleman couldn't remove his coat in a lady's presence without first apologizing and receiving permission. Coat removal suggested casual informality inappropriate around ladies. The garment removal implied relaxation incompatible with proper respect for feminine company. A gentleman might ask permission or apologize while removing it if weather made keeping it on unbearable. But removing it without acknowledgement showed disrespect. The rule maintained formal atmosphere even in casual settings. Coat-wearing discomfort was acceptable price for maintaining proper respect toward ladies present. Women avoid speaking. Too intelligently. Ladies were warned against appearing too educated or intellectually capable in front of men. Excessive intelligence was unfeminine and threatening. Women had to downplay knowledge and avoid learned discussions. Victorian etiquette books specifically warned ladies not to establish learned points through long arguments in mixed company. The restriction reflected Victorian gender roles. Women were supposed to be pleasant, agreeable, and decorative. Intellectual capability suggested inappropriately masculine traits. Educated women faced impossible situation. They possessed knowledge, but couldn't display it without violating proper feminine conduct. Intelligence had to be hidden or minimized in social settings. Men cannot compliment physical features. A gentleman never commented on a lady's physical appearance. Compliments had to concern character, accomplishments, or possessions, never face or figure. Discussing a woman's physical features suggested inappropriate focus on her body. Such comments were considered forward and offensive, regardless of intent. Acceptable compliments praised a lady's taste in dress, her accomplishment in music or art, or her character traits like kindness. Direct reference to beauty, attractiveness, or any body part violated proper conduct. This restriction seems surprising given Victorian emphasis on women's decorative roles, but explicit acknowledgement of physical appearance crossed lines into inappropriate territory. Never speak during funeral procession. Complete silence was required when funeral processions passed. Speaking showed disrespect for the dead and grieving family. People stopped whatever they were doing, removed hats, and stood silently until the procession passed. Conversation ceased immediately, regardless of topic or importance. The rule applied to everyone within sight or sound of the procession. Maintaining usual activities or conversation while a funeral passed marked you as disrespectful and poorly bred. Victorian funeral customs were elaborate and lengthy. Processions could take significant time to pass, requiring extended silence from anyone nearby. Never express hunger. Mentioning hunger suggested poor self-control and inability to manage physical needs properly. You couldn't say you were hungry, ask when meals would be served, or express anticipation of food. Such statements marked you as unable to master bodily desires. At social events, you ate when food was served without having expressed any desire for it. Enthusiasm about food also violated proper conduct. You partook modestly and appropriately without visible eagerness. The restriction reflected Victorian emphasis on self-control and restraint. Proper people supposedly didn't experience or acknowledge base physical needs like hunger. Never congratulate bride before wedding. Wishing a bride happiness before the ceremony brought bad luck. Well-wishers had to wait until after the marriage was complete. The superstition held that premature congratulations might jinx the wedding. Only after vows were exchanged could you offer congratulations safely. This created awkward social situations. Seeing a bride before her wedding required acknowledging the upcoming event without explicitly congratulating her or wishing her happiness. The rule combined etiquette with superstition, a common Victorian pattern where social conduct and folk beliefs reinforced each other. Never boast about travel. Discussing travels suggested showing off wealth and implied superiority through worldly experience. You couldn't mention exotic, locations visited, describe foreign experiences, or reference travel extensively. Such conversation implied you had money for travel while listeners might not. Travel stories were acceptable only if told briefly and when directly relevant. Lengthy travel accounts tested patience and suggested the speaker valued wealth-enabled experiences over listeners' company. The restriction seems contradictory given Victorian enthusiasm for travel writing and exploration. But personal travel boasting violated modesty requirements and suggested vulgar display of wealth. The weight of constant performance. These 20 rules represent a fraction of Victorian social code. Every action faced scrutiny and judgment. The restrictions created exhausting social performance. You monitored every word, gesture, and expression while appearing natural and effortless. The psychological burden of constant self-surveillance must have been immense. Different rules applied based on class, gender, age, and situation. Learning and remembering appropriate conduct for every circumstance required extensive training from childhood. Modern people value authenticity and self-expression. Victorian society demanded opposite, constant restraint, perpetual performance, and suppression of genuine reactions in favor of prescribed conduct. So which rule would you break first? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this exploration of Victorian restrictions, subscribe for more stories about how people really lived in the past. Thanks for watching.